today we're going to move past Abraham, so the promise continues, is the title of this section of your lecture notes. We're going to finish Genesis 25 through 50 today. Here's what's going to happen in Genesis. You've already kind of seen this a little bit with Isaac and Ishmael. There's several kind of forks in the road through Genesis. And at every fork, we're forced to ask the question, who is going to inherit the promises, right? So it's not just like the promises passed to the next physical descendant. It's almost at every place there's a Y in the road, and the text is going to help us follow the line of promise. And what happens is, when there is a line that doesn't follow the line of promise, they kind of just disappear. Like they don't come back up. Like Genesis leaves that line behind and keeps following the line of promise. So you see up here I have a picture. It's like passing the baton in track. If you guys ran track in high school, or some of you might run track here at C of O, it's interesting when you watch a relay race. I've watched relay races where it was clearly one team had the 4 fastest runners on the track. Like they could run the fastest. And you don't win. Why? Because they dropped the handoff, right? In track, in a relay race, the baton is really important to get that handoff. And so that's why you practice and you practice and you practice your handoff. You have all these little signs and things you say and stuff like that. But that's what we see in Genesis, is we're seeing the baton of the promises of God and the Abrahamic covenant being passed from generation to generation as we go through the book. Okay? So, real quick, this is going to be obvious for some of you, but let's just kind of walk through how that promise passes through the book of Genesis. Okay, so really quickly, we've already seen Abraham, right? And we already know the answer to this one from our class session on Wednesday. It passes from Abraham to Isaac. Then with Isaac, we do get another fork in the road, and it goes to Jacob. And then from Jacob, it goes to, I got Joseph. Interesting. I'm going to take the easy route and go 12 sons of Israel. But we will talk at the end of class, like, of the 12 sons, is there one that gets kind of more of a nod than the others? We'll talk about that, okay? But I'll leave you in suspense right now. Don't want to answer that for you. So I'm going to take the easy route and talk about the 12 sons of Israel. Okay? All right. So what I want to do today is just walk through these 3 stages: Isaac, Jacob, and 12 sons. And in 12 sons, we're going to focus a lot on Joseph. Okay? So let's start with Isaac. Isaac, we just talked about. We left class on last class period talking about how Isaac was Abraham's son of promise. God asked him to sacrifice him. And what's interesting about Isaac is of all of these are called the patriarchs. Has anybody heard that before? The patriarchs are just the fathers of the nation of Israel. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs. Of the patriarchs, Isaac gets the least amount of camera time. He's actually a very minor character in Genesis. In fact, he gets little camera time in the Abraham story, and in his own story, his wife gets more camera time really than he does. Rebecca does, okay? She's a very strong woman, and she gets more camera time than him. So Isaac gets the least amount of attention. But let's briefly talk about Isaac's life and think about him. So first of all, the most important thing really, and the reason he's such a transitional figure, is even in his life, his sons get a lot of attention in his story if you read it. And he has 2 sons, and their names are, we already said, Jacob and Esau. Or actually, if you put them in birth order, Esau and Jacob, right? Now, here's the deal about Esau and Jacob. It's rather interesting. When they are in the womb, you guys read this, so you guys tell me, Rebecca's a little confused because even in the womb, what are they doing? They're fighting each other. So in Genesis 25:23, as Rebecca is struggling with why her twins are struggling in her womb, she gets a prophecy, and here's the prophecy in 25:23. It says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Okay, so she's told that these 2 kids represent 2 nations. Okay, and what are the 2 nations? Jacob becomes, we just saw it, Israel. Esau becomes, anybody know? Huh? Edomites. The Edomites. Edom. Okay? Who, if you read the Old Testament, the Edomites, they live up to this promise. There's constant battle between Israel and Edom. They settle on the southern kind of part of Judah. We'll talk about that a little later. But so you get she said, the prophecy says, 2 nations are in your womb. And then it says, one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. Now, you've read through Genesis now, and this would be called what's called a motif in Genesis, or like it's like a theme, like this idea of the older serving the younger. Now, we look at that and say, what's the big deal? But in their culture, that was a pretty big deal. The firstborn or the older had privileged status. This actually comes out in the story of Jacob and Esau with what's called the birthright. So the firstborn got what's called the birthright, which meant the firstborn got a double portion of the inheritance. So in other words, if you have 2 sons, the inheritance is divided up 3 ways, and the first son gets 2 portions, and the second son only gets 1. Okay? So what's interesting about Genesis' theme of the older serving the younger is very countercultural. Okay? And so this is another example or one of our early glimpses of how God, oftentimes His ways are contrary to the culture of the day. And this would be one of them, Esau and Jacob, in this prophecy that she gives, which I should have put on your PowerPoint for you. This prophecy that she gives. Okay? So we have this prophecy, and we know right off the bat what's going to happen. But keep in mind, who doesn't know this? Who's this prophecy given to? Rebecca, not Isaac. This might come into play a little later. Okay. The only other thing I want to talk about with Isaac is Genesis 26. So really the only chapter that's fully devoted to kind of Isaac and describing Isaac is Genesis chapter 26. And in Genesis 26, the best way to think about this chapter is we would call it like father, like son. And what Genesis 26 shows us is the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to Isaac and Abraham. So I don't want you don't have to write this unless you're a really fast writer. But let me just read you, there's 6 things in Genesis 26 that Isaac does or that happened to Isaac that Abraham did or that happened to Abraham. That in one chapter, it's like, okay? So here, let me give you. First one, there's a famine in the land. Which means then Isaac has to go to another land, and we're about to talk about that. It's right there. And on his way to the other land, God reiterates the covenant promises to him. So offspring, land, and blessing. He reiterates the covenant. So we see that the covenant is passed to Isaac officially. Then guess what happens? He lies about his wife. We have another wife in danger passage with Abimelech, who's up there on the top in that little painting. So we got the sister lie. Then God blesses him, not because of the sister thing, but after that it describes his blessing. So God blesses him. Then there is some conflict over with Abimelech. By the way, Abimelech is the king of the Philistines. And there's an Abimelech in the Abraham story, and there's Abimelech in the Isaac story. Keep in mind that Abimelech, which means my father is king, is not actually his name. It's kind of like Pharaoh, right? Like the king of Egypt's called the Pharaoh. The king of the Philistines was called Abimelech. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's 2 different. That's right. It wasn't yeah. Somebody said something? Yes, it's a title. Exactly. So the Lord blesses Isaac, and then what happens is he has some conflict with Abimelech over some wells. Okay. Now I can't. Sorry, I'm from Alabama. So that's W-E-L-L. Okay. He's not having conflict over the big ones in the ocean. Everybody got this? Okay. So there's some conflict because everybody understand that they're conflict over the things you dig in the ground to get water. Those wells. Did I say it right that time? No. Okay. I give up. Yeah, wells. Okay. And then the last one is, here's the last. This is number 6. The 6th thing they have in common is there is a covenant that he makes with Abimelech. Okay? Everybody got those? So covenant with Abimelech, all those things. Those 6 things happen with Abraham. So here's what the author's trying to show us. That just like Abraham, Isaac does the same things in the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so out of this, we walk away saying, okay, yes, he's still, like his dad, he has some problems throwing his wife under the bus. But God makes a covenant with him and continues to bless him and give him favor with his enemies, is what we see in the Isaac story. All right, everybody good? Okay, let's talk about the dominant character in the second half, and that is Jacob. Now, I have a kind of a complicated slide up here that I'll let you guys write, and then we'll talk about it. This is Jacob's journey in chapters 28 to 33. And what I wanted to show you is kind of how it involves three persons that we might think about. It involves Esau, God, and a guy named Laban. Anybody want to tell the class how Jacob got his name? Anybody remember how Jacob got his name?
He deceives, isn't it?
Yeah, it can mean like he deceives. It has the connotations of trickery, trying to get the upper hand. Yes. And why did he get that name? So when they come out of the womb, Esau comes out and he's grabbing his heel. So I mean, it's like a heel grabber, right? It's kind of weird, but it really foreshadows his life. And so what happens is he actually keeps grabbing Esau's heels figuratively. In other words, there's two things that he does to kind of get the upper hand on Esau. So you see his kind of craftiness through the story. The first one is, anybody know the first one?
Birthright.
Yes, he trades the birthright. Yes, he trades the birthright for a stew, for basically a meal. Yeah. So if you haven't read the story, well, you guys read the story, so you know. I like to think of Esau as like a country boy, like he liked to hunt and fish and all those things that country boys can't survive on. And then Jacob is more of a mama's boy. He likes to stay around the tent with his mom. Okay, and so Esau went out one day and didn't have much success hunting, and he was hungry, right? So he comes in and trades his birthright for a thing of stew, which you want to say what? Like idiot. Okay. So, but here's the point of that. The point is that Jacob gets the upper hand and gets the birthright. But then what really kind of divides the brothers is where we want to start, where we will pick up. And that is when he actually steals the blessing. Do y'all remember this story? He steals the blessing when his father is old. He dresses up and his father basically thinks he is, what's his name? Jacob. He thinks he's Esau. He thinks Jacob is Esau and he blesses. And keep in mind that Rebekah's in on this. So you have to wonder, the text doesn't say, but you have to wonder if in the back of Rebekah's mind that prophecy isn't there. But like all of us, God works through their sin, in the midst of their sin, and in spite of their sin, to bring about his purposes, okay? So what happens is, after Jacob steals Esau's blessing, Esau's really mad, as you would expect, okay? So Jacob fears for his life, and his parents fear for his life, so they send him back to Haran. Do y'all remember Haran on the map the other day? That was where Abraham was from, back to their family to find a wife. So as Jacob flees to Haran, he actually meets God on the way. And this is the famous story of what's called Jacob's ladder, where God appears at a place called Bethel, which means house of God. And he sees this vision of a ladder and angels going up and down the ladder. Okay? Actually, John picks this up in the Gospels and describes Jesus that way. In other words, what that ladder represents is kind of the connecting place between heaven and earth, kind of like a garden, right, at Bethel. So he meets God, and then he gets to Laban's house, okay? And by the way, when he meets God here, all the covenant promises are reiterated. Now, you guys read the story. When he gets to Laban's house, it is like 3 soap operas in one. It gets crazy. Do y'all not agree? He's meeting his match with Laban. Laban basically does what? He out-Jacobs Jacob. You remember this?
Tricks Jacob.
Yes. So how does Laban trick him? Laban does a wife swap on his wedding night, which, by the way, you need to know a little bit of culture to understand how that even happens, because it's very confusing how that would happen. But it is possible. And then the 2 wives get into like a major rivalry on who can have the most babies. They get their 2. It is just crazy. It is like soap opera crazy. Well, eventually, though, Jacob has to sneak out and get away from Laban because Laban keeps basically trapping him there. He can't get away. This is like the worst father-in-law ever, right? You can't leave his house because he keeps tricking you and trade your wages and all this. And then as Jacob's leaving Laban, he starts going and he sends out kind of some people ahead, and they realize that he's about to enter the land of Esau. And when he's entering into Esau's country, he sends some messengers ahead and realizes that Esau's coming back to meet him. And so you remember when he left Esau was mad. So he thinks Esau's coming to meet him to do what?
Kill him.
Yeah, take him out. So basically Jacob is gripped by fear. And there's this really interesting story right here about Jacob doing what? Do y'all remember this? So God appears to him by the Jabbok River, and it's this weird story of a wrestling match with God. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Now, of all the ways that God could manifest himself to someone, the wrestling match is really unique to Jacob, okay? So let's talk about this wrestling match real quick. The question is, the bigger question, the question we all have is, what? Why? So why would God appear to Jacob and wrestle? So if you're in Genesis 32, this is where it is. So my question is, for you guys, is what would you say to this? Why would God choose to wrestle with Jacob? And by the way, how do we know it's God? Okay, one reason is he touches Jacob's hip and basically snaps it. So that's one indication that this isn't just a normal man. It could have been an angel at that point, right? So what does Jacob name the place? Does anybody remember? It's Peniel, which is face of God. So he basically says, I saw the face of God and didn't die. I mean, he recognizes that was a pretty big deal. So Peniel. Okay, so with this, why? What's the why question? Why would God wrestle with Jacob? Okay, good. That's why Jacob, so Jacob he says that he won't let him go until what? You bless me. Okay, so that's Jacob's side. What else? The why is you're hitting close to it. It's kind of a metaphor for Jacob's life, really. So look, if you got your Bibles, I'll read it real quick. Genesis 32. There's no Jacob 30. Genesis 32:28. Here's what it says. It says, then he said, and this is, by the way, basically the God, or the angel of the Lord, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So if you guys have an ESV, if you follow the one by Israel down to the bottom, it literally means basically who strives or wrestles with God. So when you say Israel, every time you say the word Israel, you're bringing back this reference to this place. Now, here's the deal. It says, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have striven with God and men. So what this is showing is God is using this struggle as a picture of kind of Jacob's whole life. Jacob's life thus far has been characterized by nothing but struggle with men and God. Think about it. He struggled with Esau. He struggled with Laban. He struggled with God. And God now is showing him that he has come. Here's the deal. He brought Jacob to the point, right, where Jacob, what is Jacob begging God to do? Bless him. So think about it. Jacob, in all his human craftiness, his plotting, has been able to get the upper hand on almost everybody he's encountered. But now he's come to the point in his life where he realizes that he needs God's blessing. He's brought him to the place because he's afraid. So many people would, quote unquote, if we're looking at this from like New Testament lenses, count this as Jacob's salvation or conversion experience. Jacob is being brought to the point of brokenness where he realizes that he cannot go on unless God blesses him. That's why he says, basically he begs him to bless him, and he says there he blessed him. God ended up blessing him there. Okay, so Jacob's desperate. God comes in a wrestling match, and he renames him Israel, so that every time now that we say Israel, it reminds us of this very wrestling match. Okay, this would be called, by the way, a theophany. A theophany is an appearance of God, but this is a unique theophany. Usually they're not quite that way. So, all right, and by the way, end of the story is he meets Esau, and Esau does what? Yeah, hugs and kisses him instead of killing him. So it's a rather interesting story. All right, everybody good? So Jacob, and then now after the Jacob story, the rest of Genesis is focused on which brother? Joseph. You guys know Joseph. Joseph's very familiar. In the Joseph story, what do we see? You guys, if you've been to Sight and Sound, you've been around Branson, and you know that it's the Joseph story. It's a story of what? What do we usually use as a takeaway for the Joseph story?
Favoritism.
Okay, so yeah. So a lot of times we talk about favoritism. And what other moral do we take away from the story? So one is don't show favoritism.
Forgiveness?
Yes, yeah. Forgiveness is usually the biggest takeaway from the story that we have, because Joseph forgave his brothers at the end, right? So let's talk real quick. I don't want to rehearse the story. I think Joseph, of all the stories in Genesis, is the most familiar. But I do want to push us in another direction. The forgiveness is important. I'm not saying that's not important. But there's another direction that's related to that. And here's the direction I want us to go. Thinking about the Joseph story, here's my question, you guys. How does the Joseph story relate to the theme of the offspring? Remember we said the theme of offspring went through Abraham. It went through even, obviously, Jacob. He's had a lot of babies. Thank you for noticing that. So the blessing is prominent too. God was with him. In fact, it said it as soon as he lands in the jail, it's a reminder that God's with him, which is like, for us, it's like, oh, God's working behind the scenes, his plan. Good. What else? So let me ask you guys one question. I gave you a hint with Abraham. I said there's something about the Abraham story that it was pretty obvious. I made a joke about it. That was an obstacle to the offspring. And I said if it shows up again, it should be an indication. Yeah. Famine, yes. So what was the big deal about the famine? There was a big famine, right, in the Joseph story? And how does that relate to offspring?
He saved a lot of people.
Thank you. But in particular, which people?
His family.
That's right. So let me show you. So here we go. The significance of Joseph in Egypt is salvation for Jacob's family. Now, I just want you to see this so you don't think I'm making this up. Okay? I'm not making this up. I'm not reading into the text. If you remember when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, okay, here's what he tells them. He says, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant. A remnant means a small group that remains on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. Do y'all see that? So Joseph, as his brothers realize what they've done and who that is, he reminds them that he's there in order to save them. So he says, God sent me. Who sent him? Didn't his brothers sell him? Right? And so what he's saying is that they're selling him to Egypt, by the way, as a slave, is God sending him before him. That is a pretty and powerful statement. But so that's how it relates to offspring, is by the famine, his whole family was in danger of dying. And yet God had put Joseph in the perfect position to provide for his family, and so he saves the family. Now, there's another verse in the Joseph story that's really important and perhaps probably one of the key themes in the story. And that is, if you guys remember, it relates to this one. If you remember at the very end, after Jacob dies, then Joseph's brothers are afraid that Joseph's going to do what? Do you remember this? Take vengeance on him. And what does he tell his brothers? It's one of the most famous lines out of the Joseph story. You meant it for, anybody recognize this?
Oh, you meant it for evil.
Evil, but God meant it for good. Okay, you see what he's saying? He's telling his brothers. This is the part where it's clear he's forgiven them, right? This is why it's so powerful. But understand this. We talk a lot about Joseph's forgiveness, but we need to talk a little more about his perspective on why he was willing to forgive so quickly. And that is, he interpreted all the things that happened in his life as God's work in his life. And that's not easy. That's actually very hard. I mean, Joseph had some pretty significant trials. And he's saying, listen, you guys, take his brothers, you were doing evil to me. You meant it for evil. But God meant it for good. That takes a great deal of faith to say something like that. And it takes a great deal of perspective. Now, do you think Joseph felt that way when he was sitting in a jail cell? I would probably say no. He probably wasn't saying, man, my brothers meant this for evil, but God's using it for good. I think what happens is Joseph sees this after the events, right? And this is important because what the Joseph story screams more than anything else is God's sovereignty. What do we mean by sovereignty? What we're basically saying when we say God's sovereignty is God's control or God's rule over the affairs of human events. In other words, God is orchestrating all the events in Joseph's life to accomplish his plan, and Joseph basically spells it out right here. God sent me here to preserve your family. Now here's the deal. Oftentimes in our lives, it's hard to see how God is working in the moment, especially in difficult times. But oftentimes, though, when we get further down the road, we can look back and see how God worked things. So I remember a few Christmases ago, I better say like 10 Christmases ago, my mom bought my kids some connected dots, okay? But they weren't your normal connected dots. You know, a normal connected dot is like an 8.5 by 10, 8.5 by 11 page, like, 30 dots. These were giant connected dots. They were like this big, and they probably had 300 to 400 dots per picture. And it was interesting as I was watching my kids try to count to 400 and connect those dots. It was interesting, though, because especially on a connected dot that big, it really takes a while before you can make out what the picture's going to be. You know how, like, with 40, if you have like 40 dots, pretty much by dot 15, you kind of got an idea of what it is. In fact, sometimes you can tell even before you do dot 1. but then you just fill in the details. Well, with these 400 ones, you don't have a clue until they get to about a dot 100, and then you kind of start taking some guess. But then by the time you're done, you look back and you see all the dots connected, and you know exactly what it is with all the details. I think that's the way it works in life for us as believers, is a lot of events happen in our life. And each event that happens is like a dot. And oftentimes we're on dot 50, we don't really get the picture. We don't see the full picture of what God's doing. But as we get further in life, and get higher in our dots that we're connecting, and we're able to look back, we begin to see that God is really painting a beautiful picture. But it's only as time passes and we can look back. And here's the deal. Some things in our life, we might not, some of the dots in our life, some of the things that happen in our life, we might not be able to make sense of even before death. It might be only when we get into eternity and are able to look back on our whole life and see how God used the dots to paint a beautiful picture. Now, that's not to say, and we could talk about this on Free Question Friday, that God causes every dot. But we do see that God allows every dot. And as believers, here's the kicker. We have a really cool promise. In Romans 8:28, and you guys know this verse, for God does what? For we know that God works all things together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purposes. So as a believer, even if you can't make sense of a dot in your life, i.e. a bad event, a really terrible thing that happened, God is still able to use that for good somewhere in your life. And again, you might not ever know this side of eternity. So I just encourage you guys, as you go through life and you walk through events, have the faith that Joseph did in God's sovereignty. In other words, His control and what He allows to come into our lives, to know that God's got a plan and that God's working for good, even when other people mean it for evil. God can still use it for good. And by the way, is this not a great resource for resisting vengeance? If you know that God can work all things for good in your life, even when people do things wrong to you and do evil to you, it is a great resource for vengeance. That's why Paul said, he quoted this verse that says, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, right? This is the reason, this is the resource, okay? Did any of you ever heard the guy named Jim Elliot? Ever heard of Jim Elliot? Jim Elliot was a missionary to Ecuador. And what was interesting about Jim Elliot is he actually never got to see the fruition of what he did because he was martyred for his faith. But it's interesting, Jim Elliot's interesting because not only does Jim Elliot show us how God uses our lives for the good of others, but Jim Elliot's a great example of somebody who's willing to lay down his life for the sake of the kingdom. But what's interesting is Jim Elliot was murdered by him and a few of his traveling companions when he went to this tribe to try to share the gospel with them. He had built a connection with them, but then they murdered him. But what's interesting is because of him and his friend's death, that tribe eventually, widespread members of that tribe, many members of that tribe came to Christ. And in fact, their wives and their children began to develop relationships with that tribe. So here's the deal. Jim Elliot's death, he never saw the good that came out of it, but much good. God used his death for much good for the sake of His kingdom. And much in the same way with Joseph. Joseph went through a lot of sufferings, and he got some benefits. He was second in command to Pharaoh. That's pretty good benefit. But also the good that God brought out of it also helped his family and others as well. So Joseph is in Egypt. He's a big dog in Egypt, and he moves his family down to Egypt. Okay? So this is setting us up for what book that we're about to talk about after your test? Exodus, okay? But Joseph brings his family down to Egypt. I'll show you a map real quick. You know, we looked at this last time. So basically think about Abraham's family. They've gone all the way from this side of the Fertile Crescent. Now they're all the way down here on this side. They're up here in the Delta region. So we've seen kind of a big move. And they're down in Egypt now settling. And when we open Exodus, that's going to set us up, okay? Now, the final question I have. Earlier, I heard two Josephs. Okay, so Joseph gets a lot of camera time in Genesis. So the question is after you leave, you got the 12 tribes. So they're all really inheriting the blessing. But is there one brother that gets a nod over the others? Okay, now I got Judas. I heard Joseph early and Judas. Okay, so there is a sense, by the way, in which both of you are right. If you said Joseph, you're right, and if you said Judah, you're right. Because it's interesting, in Chronicles, the book of Chronicles, it tells us that Joseph received the birthright. In other words, he got a double portion. And does anybody know how he got a double portion in the land? We'll talk about it when we get to Joshua. He had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they both got a portion with the other 10. So let's leave it at that. They both got a portion. So Joseph gets a double inheritance in the land, so he gets the birthright. But what I want you to see, though, is there is one brother that gets kind of the nod above the rest, and that is, like I heard 3 people on this side say, that is Judah. Okay? So let's briefly talk about Judah. Did you guys notice in your reading last night how Judah kind of progressed through the story of Joseph? So notice that. Remember, he went from early on kind of giving the idea of selling his brother into slavery, but by the end of the story, he becomes the hero. Why does he become the hero? He offers to give his life for the sake of Benjamin. So he's come full circle, right? He was willing to sacrifice Joseph and get rid of him, but by the end of the story, he comes full circle. So the story actually, and there's that weird story, by the way, in there about Judah and Tamar. Do you remember that one? Yeah, that was weird. Thank you. There's a good reason that story's in there, this points to it. You're like, when you read that story of Judah and Tamar, you're like, why in the world is this in the middle of the Joseph story? But this is about to answer it for us. Because so at the end of Genesis, Jacob gathers around all the sons, and it says he tells them what's going to happen to them in the latter days. And here's what he says. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before him. For you, Judah is a lion's club. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now, I got a phrase underlined here. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Who did we just read that happen to? Joseph. You remember Joseph's dreams? Do you remember when the brothers came to Egypt? What did they have to do? Joseph's second command. They had to bow down before him. So what's interesting is what just happened to Joseph in the story is pushed into the future, not onto Joseph, but on Judah. So in other words, Joseph's past becomes a picture of Judah's future. And Judah is the one who's going to rule over his brothers, okay, like Joseph did in the story. So this is really significant because as we go through the Bible, we're going to see how Judah is going to be the ruling tribe. I don't want to give you all the details later, but does anybody, just to kind of close class, recognize the imagery of a lion being connected to Judah? What is Jesus called in the book of Revelation? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. You see in the pickup here. So in other words, Judah's going to be the ruling tribe. Joseph's still going to be important. So he's not gone, but Judah's going to take precedence as the one who rules over his brothers, just like Joseph did in his story. Which explains why, by the way, the Judah-Tamar story is there. Because if Judah's line is going to be the ruling line, we need to know something about his descendants. And we find out a little bit about his descendants in that weird story in Genesis chapter 39.